The Night. A short story written by Tim Gritman. Author's note: this story is inspired by the many episodes of The Twilight Zone. The night started out as normal as any other. Every star in the night was clearly visible in the night sky, and the moon was shining bright. There was a slight breeze and you could hear the wind blowing through the trees. Walking alone on a gravel road with no other soul in sight is where we find John. The first time you would look at John, you would gather rather quickly that the world has been rather hard on him. John, being quite down on his luck, was walking just to be walking, with absolutely no destination in mind. His past being darker than the night, John just keeps walking. No home to return to, all of his belongings are on his person and no definite future in sight. Along the way, he stops at a small diner. Walking inside, it is quite apparent that there is not a lot of income for this diner. The owners of the diner also reside in the diner, with their home being in the back and the upstairs of the building. The actual dining area is no bigger than a small convenience store, only containing 6 small round tables, with 4 rickety chairs placed around each. The tablecloth had many holes in them patched with duct tape, obviously had seen their days. John sat down at a table only looking for a hot cup of coffee and a bowl of soup. A rather plump woman came out and took his order. She was not dressed well, with rollers in her hair and a cigarette hanging out of her mouth. She poured the coffee and placed it in front of him. By the appearance of the coffee and the taste, it had probably sat in the pot for a day or two. Then the woman proceeded to microwave a small bowl of soup for the man. Rather bad service by today's standards, but John didn't care. He didn't have much money and couldn't expect good service either. As he was sitting eating his soup, the woman placed a closed sign in the front window and told him that he may lock the door on his way out. John takes his time eating, as it was rather cold out. Nobody could blame him for not going back outside any sooner than what he had to. A quiet, yet melodic tune plays from the radio sitting in the corner of the room. It had almost a hypnotizing effect on John. Just after eating, the warm room begins to have its effects on him. John leans back in his chair, and kicks his feet up on the table as he begins to nod off. Suddenly, the music stops and the lights go off, one happening just a moment after the other. The room plunges into darkness, the only light coming from the window in the front near the door. The window had been covered in what appeared to be an old shawl and just gave John enough light to stumble his way to the door and let himself out. Outside, there was no light except from the stars and the moon. It seemed all other light had been swallowed up by the night. Turning around, John discovered that even the diner he had just come out of, which he could not be more than a few feet from, could not be seen in the night. Only darkness could be seen where the diner had been. John walks back to where the diner was, and keeps walking until he realizes that he could not have been that far away from it. He knew it was there, but where? In the moonlight, he could clearly make out the outlines of trees and shrubbery, but why couldn't he see the diner? It had to be there. It just had to be there. John began to panic, his own sanity being questioned. Was there a diner or wasn't there? John sits down next to a tree and thinks. He retraces his own footsteps in his mind. He leaves the diner and only walks a few steps away and takes in a quick scan of his surroundings. He turns around and the diner was gone. Impossible. Perhaps he turned too far. Perhaps the diner had been there all along and he just walked past it. Impossible. He would have been able to see the outline of the roof and walls if he had walked past it. So what happened? John stands up and looks at the road. The diner was right next to the road, wasn't it? Right next to the diner, there was a light pole. It wasn't there now. He couldn't have walked that far. He looks down the road, and then looks back up the road. Impossible. There is absolutely no way it could just disappear. Could it? He takes out a silver flask and takes a drink. Was he losing his mind? He leans back and falls all the way to the ground. John scrambles to his feet almost before he hit the ground. There was a tree right behind him. He was just sitting against it. John quickly swings his head around back and forth, straining his eyes to find the tree he had been sitting under just a few moments earlier. This is crazy. How could it be possible that there were no trees that looked similar to the one he had just been sitting against? He chuckled, thinking to himself that he has really lost it now. Sanity is no longer a luxury for John. Has it gotten darker? Little by little, John noticed that he could not see things as clearly as he could before. He looked to the sky for his only source of light, only to see the many stars that scatter the sky, but he could not locate the moon. Maybe the moon had moved beyond the horizon. It was the only sane explanation that John could come up with. John sits with his knees pressed against his chest, arms wrapped around his legs, slowly rocking back and forth. Occasionally, he will take a drink from his flask, mumbling to himself, trying to figure out what was going on. Suddenly, he jumped up and threw the flask into the night, having come to the conclusion that he had a little too much to drink and he was hallucinating. It was all in his head. That is what he tried to tell himself, but he just could not believe it. Still standing on one leg with the other stretched out behind him, his throwing arm still pointing where he had thrown his flask, something didn't seem right. John never heard the flask land. What happened to it? It surely hit something. It would have hit the ground if nothing else. It doesn't just vanish into thin air. John starts walking forward, searching for any sign of it. He could find none. Slowly, the thought occurred to John that not only could he find no evidence of his flask hitting the ground, he could not find any trace of anything else on the ground. No weeds, no rocks, no bushes, absolutely nothing but bare ground. Could it be that the night had consumed everything in sight? Impossible. John took out a book of matches and began striking one. He never was good at lighting them, and in his current situation, he had a difficult time remaining steady enough to strike the match. But with enough determination, he was swiftly able to get one lit. As the flame burst into life, the darkness around him recoiled back away from the glow. Looking around, John saw absolutely nothing. No trace of life, no traces of any object at all. He began to run to find something, anything that would tell him that he was not insane. Almost as quickly as the flame had started, it disappeared. The darkness closed in on John even more so than before. There was no light at all, the stars had all disappeared. He could not even see his hand in front of his face. What was going on? How could this possibly be happening? As John began to lose hope, the darkness began to feel as if it were a heavy blanket and was smothering him. It was as thick as the murkiest swamp. There were no sounds, no light, absolutely nothing. It was as if the only things that the night hadn't engulfed were John and the ground he was laying on. John was lost, in complete and utter darkness. John began walking. Walking just to be walking, with no destination in mind. Desperately trying to find a future full of light, any light at all, John keeps walking. John had nothing to return to, no diner, and no tree, not even the road. But yet he keeps walking. Walking to find a way out of this darkness, walking to be walking, and mostly, walking to find a light. Walking to find something besides the darkness he finds himself in.